Hey guys, welcome back to the Red Bed. Today I've gathered 2 hours of real life Reddit stories to listen to while you unwind, fall asleep, or just have running in the background. Most of these stories are about people who take instructions way too literally, and honestly, the payoffs are ridiculously satisfying. I try to post these videos daily, so if you're enjoying them, make sure to subscribe. But now, kick back, relax, and enjoy as I progress through this hardcore world with my friends. This first story is about a company that was suddenly evicted during lockdown, only to discover the landlord planned to profit from their equipment and how they turned the tables with some serious malicious compliance. I work for a leisure company, the kind of place with indoor activities like soft play, soccer, and laser tag. Before the lockdown started, our managers had been in talks with the landlord about renewing the lease on one of our sites. Things were moving along, but the landlords weren't exactly easy to get hold of. Then 2020 hit and everything fell apart. All of our locations shut down overnight. Negotiations got pushed to the back burner because, honestly, no one thought the landlord would force an eviction in the middle of a pandemic, especially not when rent was still being paid, even while the business couldn't open. But we were wrong. Out of the blue, we got a letter saying we had 7 days to vacate. Everything had to be removed, or else it would automatically become the landlord's property. That detail turned out to be really important. Now, if you've ever seen one of these parks, you'll know the amount of construction that goes into setting one up. Pulling it all out again is a massive job. Add in the fact that we had no staff on hand, and most businesses were closed because of lockdown, and it looked nearly impossible to salvage much of anything. At first, it felt like a crushing loss, but then just a few days into that 1 week deadline, we found out what the landlord was up to. He had been advertising the site to our competitors, not just the building itself, but with all of our equipment included. He was bragging that it was ready to go, just needs rebranding. That was his entire plan. Kick us out, hike up the rent, and make a profit off the installations he assumed we couldn't remove. We were furious, and that's when we leaned into his own rules. He said we had 7 days to move everything that was ours, so that's exactly what we did. Local businesses stepped in with free storage space. A few staff came out of lockdown to help. Piece by piece, we stripped the building. We took the flooring we'd installed, ripped down every non-structural wall, dismantled the manager's office, and cleared out lockers, fridges, artwork, everything. We didn't even leave the usual extras like disco lights in the ceiling. We completely gutted the place. By the time we handed the keys back, the building was a shell. The landlord avoided conversation during the handover, but he couldn't say a word about missing equipment. It was all ours to begin with. He also had no grounds to withhold our deposits, because we'd kept up maintenance and cleaned the space after demolishing everything. With a little pressure from our legal team, we got every penny of those deposits back. Meanwhile, we managed to sell off a lot of the salvage equipment, which gave the company some much-needed cash to pay staff during the closures. The landlord, on the other hand, was stuck with an empty building, no rent coming in, and a hefty renovation bill staring him in the face. Last I heard, the site was still vacant. That's where the story ends. That's such a wild chain of events. What really caught me was how the landlord assumed they'd just roll over and leave everything behind, and then got hit with the complete opposite. The thought of them walking into an empty shell of a building after bragging to competitors is pretty hilarious. I also liked how the team didn't just salvage things. They actually turned it into extra money to support staff. It's one of those stories where the payoff feels extra satisfying because everything lined up just right. This next story is about an IT team forced to work on the 4th of July by a VP who didn't respect them, only for things to spiral into the most expensive office party the company had ever seen. It all started when I got an email from a vice president who wasn't even over my department. She told me my team would be required to work on July 4th. I pushed back politely, explaining that we'd already scheduled the day off and that people had made plans. But if you've ever worked in IT, you know, it's the department that always gets shafted. I kept my team updated throughout the week, telling them I was reaching out to higher-ups to try to fix it. I promised that if their holiday plans got ruined, I'd make it right somehow. After 3 meetings, it was looking like nothing would change. So I escalated it to the CEO. Everyone supported that decision because he's very family-oriented, but the timing couldn't have been worse. He was on vacation in the Bahamas until July 6th. His assistant told me he'd look at it afterward. At that point, I figured we'd just work from home. I even set up call routing so most support requests would hit my cell phone. I honestly expected almost no calls anyway. And as for that notice they wanted me to send out saying it would be available, I never sent it. Then came the kicker. I was told not only did my team have to work, but we weren't allowed to do it from home. They were going to check badge scans at the office to make sure we showed up. When I asked why, I was told it was to stop us from playing video games. Mind you, we usually worked from home 2/3 of the week, and gaming in the office was already normal. So I went to this VP's office to talk. After a long back and forth where she was running out of logic, she dropped the line that floored me. "It's just it. You guys don't have lives." I reported that to my own VP. He just told me, "I'll handle this later. For now, get creative." And I knew exactly what that meant. I emailed back asking if we could at least throw an office party since we were being forced in. She said yes, as long as it didn't interfere with calls. She even told me to use my company credit card and said, "Go wild." That was her mistake. I pulled the team together and asked what they had planned for the holiday. A couple had fireworks lined up, others had barbecues with family. I told them to go ahead and invite their families to the office instead because I was taking care of everything. No one needed to bring a thing. The 4th rolled around and we did 0 actual work. Only 7 calls came in, all from the bad VP checking on us. By evening, I rolled out the surprise. A catered feast. Not just hot dogs and burgers, but full smoked brisket, ribs, sausage, turkey, sides like potato salad and green beans, pizzas from 2 different restaurants, custom cakes, pies, cookies, and fudge. Families and friends showed up. Kids ran around. My VP even brought water balloons for them. Out back, once it got dark, we crossed the little footbridge behind the office, which conveniently crossed into another county, and set off fireworks. By the time the night ended, no one had touched a single IT ticket. We'd eaten until we were stuffed, sent leftovers home, and spent the holiday together like we should have in the first place. The bad VP called one more time around 7:50. I told her, "Well, you're the only one who called today. The rest of us are on the patio enjoying the shindig." She said she didn't care as long as there was no alcohol or fireworks on company property, which technically there weren't. The next morning, I submitted the expense report. The final total? Over $6,000. That party was more expensive than some executive dinners the CEO had hosted. When the CEO got back, he was furious. Not at me, but at the fact IT had been singled out to work, while other departments stayed home. He blasted the higher-ups in a company-wide email about respecting holidays and work-life balance. The bad VP ended up getting chewed out so badly she sent me an apology. Last I heard, she either lost her position or her influence, because she hasn't been seen since. And funnily enough, there's no more pushback against remote work for us anymore. That's the end of this story. That was such a satisfying chain of events. The detail that cracked me up was the VP saying, "Go wild." Like that wouldn't backfire immediately. The fact that it turned into the priciest party in company history makes it even better. What also stood out was how calm and methodical it all was. Every move was technically within the rules, just used in the smartest way possible. And the part where the CEO got mad at management instead of the IT team, that's just the perfect ending. Sometimes the best revenge doesn't come from breaking rules, but from following them a little too well. This next story is about a strict supermarket manager who threatened to fire an employee for calling in sick, only for that decision to completely backfire in the best way. Back when I was in my early 20s, I worked at a supermarket. I had a solid track record there. I was always on time, usually showed up early, and I rarely ever called in sick. In fact, the last time I'd been sent home ill was almost 9 months earlier, and even then, my manager had made that call, not me. One night, though, I came down with something rough. I was running a fever that kept swinging from burning hot to freezing cold, and I was stuck throwing up over and over again. At one point around 2 in the morning, I was sitting on the toilet with my head resting in the sink, so weak I must have passed out right there. The next thing I knew, it was 7 in the morning. My shift was due to start at noon, and there was no way I was going to make it in. So I called my manager, Steve. He was already known for being difficult. He never believed staff when they called in sick, though he had no problem taking sick days himself, often when everyone knew he was just hungover. The conversation went exactly how you'd expect. I told him I was too sick to come in, that I'd been throwing up and had a fever. His response? He barked that if I really had the flu, I'd be completely knocked out, and he needed me in regardless. He told me flat out, either come in or bring a doctor's note, or I was fired. Now, in the UK, you're legally allowed to self-certify for up to 5 days without needing a doctor's note. It's actually illegal for an employer to demand one during that period. I knew this, but I was terrified of losing my job. The recession was still hitting hard, and I couldn't afford to be unemployed. So I pushed myself to get dressed, nearly passing out again in the process, and walked 25 minutes to the doctor's office. When I got there, the doctor was furious with me. You're not supposed to come in for colds or flu since there's not much they can do for you, and all it does is risk spreading it to other patients. But when I explained the situation with Steve, her anger shifted toward him. She asked if I received sick pay, and when I said yes, she told me she'd make sure he got the note he asked for. Except it wasn't the note Steve was expecting. Instead of a simple confirmation, she wrote that I'd been forced to attend the surgery because my manager illegally demanded it. She listed that I had a fever of 39 degrees Celsius, had nearly passed out, and that because of being forced to make this trip, I was being signed off for a full 2 weeks. She added that if I'd been allowed to self-certify as the law intended, I probably would have only needed a few days. When I brought the note in, one of the duty managers took one look at me and insisted on helping me down to Steve's office. I handed him the paper. He looked pale and immediately backpedaled, saying he hadn't been serious about firing me. The duty manager wasn't having it. They actually ended up driving me home themselves and later reported everything to our union rep. Steve got called into a disciplinary hearing where he tried to deny what happened, but the duty manager confirmed that he'd admitted to threatening me. He ended up with a severe reprimand and a final warning. Meanwhile, I spent a few days resting up, then enjoyed the rest of my fully paid 2 weeks off in the nice weather. And to make it even sweeter, Steve had to cover overtime because we were short-staffed. All because he pushed me for a doctor's note I didn't legally need. That story wraps up here. That one really stood out. It's wild how the manager's own stubbornness turned a couple of sick days into a 2-week paid break. The part that made me laugh was him trying to claim he wasn't serious after getting caught. It's the exact opposite of what a tough guy act sounds like. I also liked how the doctor handled it. Instead of just signing a quick note, she made sure it hit him where it hurt. And the image of him stuck doing overtime while you were at home recovering in the sunshine is just the perfect ending. This next story is about a neighbor who constantly blocks someone's garage, leading to late-night confrontations, intimidation tactics, and finally, a tow truck showdown. When I first moved into my new apartment, I thought the biggest challenge would be unpacking all my boxes. Instead, it turned out to be my neighbor. The building had 10 units, with individual garages lined up in the alley behind us. I had a 1-bedroom unit with my own garage, and right on that first day, I met someone who called herself La Crystal. She didn't even say hello before pointing to the space in front of my garage and telling me, I park there. I was caught off guard. I asked why she didn't use her own garage, and she casually explained that hers was already taken up by some old broken down car. She then handed me her number and said, "Just call me if you need me to move." At first, I didn't want to start drama with a new neighbor, so I just went along with it. But it didn't take long for the whole arrangement to become a nightmare. I had to leave for work around 4 in the morning, and half the time her car was in the way. I'd call her, wait 10 minutes, and she still wouldn't come out. If I called again, she'd scream into the phone that she was already on her way. Sometimes I'd come home late at night and couldn't even get into my own garage because she was blocking me again. After a while, I had enough. I asked her directly to stop parking there, but she wouldn't listen. Since the property owner was a buddy of mine, I finally told him what was going on. He responded by putting up signs warning that any car blocking garages would be towed. Sure enough, one night I came home with my girlfriend, and there she was, parked right in front of my garage again. I called her 3 times, and every time she sent me straight to voicemail. When I walked by her unit, I could actually hear her inside, talking trash about me. At that point, I didn't bother arguing. I called the tow truck, and her car was hauled away. The next morning, while I was at work, my girlfriend called to say La Crystal was standing outside my window, loudly ranting on the phone about how some guy in a 1-bedroom had her car towed, and how I supposedly owed her $300. When I got home later, she was in the courtyard with this creepy grin plastered on her face. She greeted me sweetly, like she was trying to play some game, then got back on her phone, saying I better pay up if I wanted to keep breathing. Not long after, she brought over a guy, probably her boyfriend. He was huge, even bigger than me, and I'm no small guy. Every time I stepped outside, he'd come out too, just staring me down in silence. We never said a word to each other, but it was clear what he was there for. I didn't give in, though. I never paid her a cent. And the funniest part, just a few days later, she got towed again, this time for blocking somebody else's garage. The property owner, who also happened to be driving by, saw it himself and made the call. That story wraps up here. Man, that escalated way beyond a simple parking issue. It's wild how something so small, just moving a car, turned into intimidation, threats, and tow trucks. What stood out to me was how casual she acted. Like blocking a garage was completely normal. Then to flip it and demand money after getting towed? That's just baffling. Honestly, the patience it must have taken not to blow up earlier is impressive. Sometimes you just have to let the consequences play out on their own. This next story is about a grocery store parking lot confrontation where a careless driver claimed to have left kids in a hot car, only to end up facing some serious consequences. A few years back, I had my whole crew with me, my pregnant wife and 3 kids, as we stopped at H-E-B for groceries. Anyone who's ever shopped with a family like that knows it feels like moving a circus into the store. It was summer in Texas, so the heat was brutal. Outside, it was already pushing 95 degrees, and inside a car with the windows rolled up, it could easily feel like 130 or more. The parking lot was packed, and we were inching down the row looking for a spot when some guy in the opposite lane suddenly darted ahead and snagged the expectant mother or with children space. I couldn't help but think what a selfish move that was. We ended up parking farther down the row, which meant wrangling the kids through a busy lot while also pushing the stroller. By the time we got out and started walking toward the store, the guy finally stepped out of his car. What struck me was how it took him a solid 5 minutes to get out after rushing into that spot. As he passed by us, I said, while pushing the stroller, "Hey, that parking is really for pregnant women or families with small kids." Without missing a beat, he waved it off and said, "Yeah, the kids are in the car," in this dismissive tone like it was no big deal. That stopped me for a second. I played along, but pointed out, "It's too hot for anyone to be left in a car without air conditioning. That's not safe." He brushed me off again and muttered, "They'll be fine. Don't worry about it." That was the last straw for me. My wife and I were already trying to keep 2 kids from running into traffic and pushing another in a stroller across extra distance, and here's this guy basically admitting he left kids in a roasting car. As we walked inside, I noticed a manager standing near the entrance. I told her exactly what the man had said, word for word, and I pointed him out. I made it clear I hadn't looked into his car myself, but I thought someone needed to know. In Texas, leaving kids or pets in cars isn't just careless. It can turn deadly in under 15 minutes. And H-E-B isn't the type of place to let something like that slide. They've got a reputation for caring about the community, and there's usually a police officer on site just in case. All I did was pass along what the man told me. Nothing more. His own words were enough to bring attention to the situation. The manager thanked me and said they'd look into it, and I went about our shopping with my family. Roughly 25 minutes later, we came back outside with our groceries, and there he was. The same guy, now standing beside his car, animatedly talking to a constable. The officer didn't look impressed at all. His face had that firm, disapproving expression, like he'd already heard enough excuses. As I loaded our groceries, I couldn't help but smile to myself and think back to what he told me earlier. "They'll be fine. Don't worry about it." That story ends there. That's such a wild chain of events from something as simple as a parking spot. What stuck with me is how casually the guy said he left kids in the car, like it was no big deal. It's almost unbelievable someone would even say that out loud, especially in Texas heat. The ending was kind of poetic too, seeing him stuck, explaining himself to a cop while the storyteller just walked away. Sometimes people really do trap themselves with their own words. This next story is about divorced parents locked in a custody battle where personal property kept going missing, and one parent had to draw the line when their ex refused to return it. My ex-wife and I share custody of our 3 kids equally. We split the time right down the middle, and no child support is paid either way. The marriage itself ended pretty badly, so we only communicate when absolutely necessary, and that's through a parenting app. She's remarried now, and in her household, she's also raising two stepkids. For a while, things seemed manageable, but then issues started popping up with my personal property. It began with an old cell phone. I gave my oldest my phone after one of her stepkids broke theirs. Instead of letting our child keep it as intended, she told them the phone was staying at her house. When I asked for it back, she flat out refused. I even went over in person to get it, but she claimed she had every right to confiscate it. After following up in writing, she still told me she wasn't returning it and that I should just get over it. The next time it happened, it was with my tools. My daughter had borrowed them for a school project, but since it was a custody exchange day, she ended up at her mom's afterward. My ex decided it wasn't appropriate for her to have them, so she took the tools and refused to give them back. I made sure to document that one with a written exchange as well. And then came the breaking point. My youngest needed an old iPod for a class assignment about outdated tech. I lent him mine, simple enough, but apparently her 13-year-old stepkid had a similar assignment later on. She decided both kids should get to use the iPod, and once again, she told me she wasn't giving it back. At that point, I knew if I let it slide again, it would just keep happening. So I told her in writing to return it. When she refused, I called the police. She ended up handing everything back, but she completely blew up over it. She accused me of being spiteful, of making something petty into a bigger deal than it needed to be. She argued that I could have just waited until her stepkid was finished, and she claimed I was only doing this to be difficult. To me, it wasn't about being petty. It was about her repeatedly keeping things that didn't belong to her. What I give to my kids is for my kids. It's not meant for her stepkids. They have their own parents to provide for them. From my perspective, she crossed the line one too many times, and I wasn't going to let her keep my stuff anymore. That's where the story ends. What stood out here is how small items like phones or tools can turn into full-blown battles when there's history between two people. It's interesting how quickly the tone shifted once the police were involved. Suddenly, the things that were no big deal were handed back right away. I think the frustration comes from the pattern, not the individual items, and that's what made it escalate. It's one of those stories where you can feel how exhausting the back and forth must have been, especially when kids are caught in the middle of it. Sometimes the drama isn't about the thing itself, it's about respect, or the lack of it. This next story is about a neighbor dispute that started with petty complaints and eventually turned into a clever bit of payback during a backyard party. When I first moved into my house, I thought the biggest adjustments would be things like unpacking or fixing up the place. Instead, the real challenge turned out to be my backyard neighbor. Not long after I closed on the property, this was in late December, she came knocking in the early spring with demands. She wanted me to spend $10,000 building a dry well to stop rainwater from flowing downhill into her yard. The thing is, my property has been higher than hers for over 60 years. It's just the way the land sits. I told her no, but I did offer to let her cover the cost herself, if it mattered that much to her. Of course, she declined. That was just the beginning. A few weeks later, she called the town to complain about one of my floodlights. It was missing a cover, and she made it sound like a big violation. Code enforcement came by right in the middle of me hosting people, which was embarrassing, but the officer reassured me it wasn't a serious issue. He even mentioned she was already known for doing this sort of thing. I fixed the light, and when the inspector came back to check, he closed the case without any fines. Then came Father's Day. We had a small surprise gathering for my father-in-law's 80th birthday. We weren't blasting anything, just some music on a little Sonos speaker. A few days later, the same officer called me again. He said she'd complained, but not to worry about it. He did suggest that if I wanted to avoid future headaches, I should consider applying for a permit anytime I planned on playing music outside. Fast forward to mid-July. I was outside and overheard her on the phone, inviting people to a barbecue at her place and even mentioning the date and time. That gave me an idea. The following Monday, I went to town hall and applied for a noise permit covering that exact date and time. Sure enough, it got approved. When the day of her party rolled around, I was ready. As her guests started showing up, I cranked up some old Greek chanting music from the early 1900s. My grandparents used to play it nonstop when I was a kid, and I knew firsthand how grating it could get. Within minutes, she was at my door, pounding and ringing the bell over and over. completely losing it. The footage from my Ring doorbell caught the whole tantrum, and honestly, it was hilarious to watch back later. I didn't answer though. Instead, I went out with my wife and the neighbors on either side of me for drinks. By Monday, she had filed yet another complaint with code enforcement. The same officer showed up to handle it, but this time he let her know a permit had been issued. There was nothing she could do. That's where this story finishes. That one made me laugh. The timing of getting the permit right on her party day was just too perfect. What stood out was how much patience it must have taken to deal with all those earlier complaints without blowing up. And then when the chance came, using that permit in such a calm, calculated way, it's almost poetic. I also can't stop picturing that old Greek chanting blasting across the yard. That's such a random but brilliant choice. It's one of those rare moments where the comeback feels like it matched the situation perfectly. This next story is about a wedding where the maid of honor suddenly ghosted right before the big day, leaving the bride and her bridesmaids scrambling. I'm a bridesmaid in my friend Tara's wedding, and up until last week, everything seemed to be moving along pretty smoothly. Dresses were set, schedules were organized, and the vibe in our group chat was all excitement and planning. But then, out of nowhere, the maid of honor, Jess, went completely silent. It started last Thursday. Tara had messaged her asking to confirm a couple of simple things: her speech for the reception and the time she'd be at the rehearsal dinner. Nothing dramatic or last minute, but Jess never responded. We waited, thinking maybe she was just busy, but as the days went on, still nothing. No texts, no calls, not even an email. Her read receipts were on though, so we knew she was seeing everything and choosing not to reply. By Sunday, Tara was on edge. The biggest stress point was that Jess had the wedding veil. She had picked it up from the seamstress, and Tara didn't have a backup plan. For a while, we all assumed something serious must have happened. Maybe there was an emergency. So we held off and gave her space, trying not to jump to conclusions. Then Monday night came, and any hope of a reasonable explanation went out the window. Jess posted on Instagram. She wasn't sick. She wasn't dealing with a family crisis. She was at a cabin in the mountains, casually posing in yoga stances with a caption that read something like, "Disconnecting from drama and reconnecting with myself." A few of us even tried commenting to check in, but she deleted those comments almost instantly. And the part that really floored us? She wasn't there alone. She was with the same guy she had claimed she'd broken up with months ago. The same guy who had made things so uncomfortable at Tara's engagement party by hitting on her. It was almost surreal seeing it play out in real time. At that point, Tara was devastated, but had to keep moving forward. She asked me to step in and give the maid of honor speech. I said yes, of course, and I was genuinely honored. But the whole situation left me shaking my head. To completely vanish the week before your best friend's wedding, and then flaunt it online as some sort of self-care retreat, it just didn't make sense. And the wildest part, Jess never returned the veil. To this day, no one's heard a word from her. That story wraps up here. That one really left me kind of stunned. It's one thing to back out of wedding duties, but disappearing with the bride's veil? That's on another level. The way she framed it like some self-care getaway while the wedding was falling apart behind her, that contrast really stood out. What got me too was how quick she was to delete comments, like she didn't want to be called out. It's messy, but also kind of fascinating how people can rewrite the narrative in real time. Weddings already come with enough stress, and then something like this just drops in out of nowhere. This next story is about a breakup where one partner was left wondering if they still owed favors to their ex, even after being hurt by how things ended. Before last Wednesday, my girlfriend and I had been together for a little over 3 years. For most of that time, we managed a bit of distance. She was living in Georgia, about 2 hours away from me in South Carolina. Things shifted in August when she moved up to New York for graduate school. Wanting to be closer, I found a new job and moved to DC. To be honest, things had already been a bit rough leading up to that point. The stress of moving, her starting grad school, and me adjusting to a new job added more weight on top of what was already shaky ground. Then last Monday, she brought up something I wasn't expecting. On the phone, she told me she wasn't sure if she still wanted to be in the relationship. She admitted she felt this pull to go out, date other people, and see what else was out there. I told her straight up that wasn't what I wanted. I wanted us to push through the hard times together. But she insisted that if she didn't follow through with this urge, even if things got better between us, she'd regret not exploring it. That's where we left it. The very next day, though, she reached out again. This time, she said she wanted to come down for Thanksgiving break to spend a few days together in South Carolina before heading home to see her family. But there were strings attached. I'd have to drive 2 hours out to an airport in North Carolina to pick her up, then 2 hours back. A few days later, I'd need to drive her down to Georgia to her family and then back home. And then, after Thanksgiving, I'd have to go to Georgia again, pick her up, and drive with her all the way to DC, where she'd catch her flight back to New York. I remember asking why she wanted to go through all of this after what she just said about dating other people. She told me she thought maybe one positive experience together could help reset things. She even had the flight page pulled up, ready to book. I told her I wanted to talk it through more, but she went ahead and booked it anyway. The following day, I tried to bring up her desire to see other people and how we could actually fix things. Instead of finding middle ground, the conversation ended with her breaking up with me. Since then, she's barely responded to my texts. And when she has, it's been short and pretty harsh. When I pointed that out, she told me it was unreasonable to expect friendliness right after a breakup. Honestly, I couldn't argue with that. She was probably right. But then she texted again, this time telling me she still needed me to do all that driving for her trip, picking her up, taking her to her family, and then riding back with me after the holiday. She said she couldn't afford to change her flight and didn't have anyone else to rely on. I told her I didn't feel like I owed her that anymore. She argued that I had already committed to it, which is technically true. I asked if she could at least try to be friendly if I did help her, and she told me the best she could do was be cordial. She even said she'd probably just sit in the back and work the entire ride. So now I'm stuck wondering, do I really owe her this? Or is it selfish to tell her she needs to figure it out on her own? That's where the story ends. That one really leaves you sitting in the gray area. What stood out to me was how quickly the situation flipped, going from talk of breaking up to booking a whole holiday trip together, and then back to a breakup within days. It's also pretty striking how she expected all those rides, even after cutting things off. I found it interesting how she said she'd just sit in the back and work, like it was more of a business transaction than spending time together. It makes you realize how tangled responsibilities can feel right after a long relationship ends. This next story is about a small business owner who got flooded with wrong number calls for a doctor's office and found a clever way to solve the problem once the doctor refused to help. Several years back, my friend Mark started a home-based computer software business. He and his wife had been living in their house for about a decade, and by then, their phone number was well established in the community. This was in that transitional time when cell phones were just starting to get popular, but most people still relied on their landlines. To fit his schedule and his customers' needs, Mark set his business hours from 2 in the afternoon until 10 at night. That way, when people finished their own workdays, they could call him without interruption. And since most computer repairs still had to be done in person, folks could drop off their devices after work and pick them up from his back porch the next morning. It was a system that worked smoothly, at least at first. Then a new doctor moved to town and opened up a practice. The issue was the doctor's phone number differed from Mark's by just one single digit. Where Mark's number had a 3, the doctor's had an 8. At first it was just the occasional misdial, and Mark would politely redirect the caller. But as the practice grew, the calls kept coming in more and more often. Since the doctor was getting referrals from hospitals, Mark's phone started ringing around the clock. Patients would call after hours to reach the on-call doctor, and hospital staff would call trying to reach medical personnel. It got to the point where Mark had to unplug the phone just to eat lunch in peace or to get some sleep at night. And with 3 daughters out dating, that was not exactly a comfortable situation. Mark finally called the doctor's office to ask if they would consider changing their number. His reasoning was simple. He'd had his phone for years, and his family needed some peace and quiet. But the doctor brushed him off, saying it was too expensive to reprint stationery, business cards, and signage, and it would be a hassle to update medical registries and hospital records. The doctor basically told him, "Too bad, just deal with it. The calls will slow down eventually." Mark didn't argue. Instead, he cheerfully said, "Okie dokie, I'll do my best to take care of things." And that's when he came up with a plan. From then on, Mark personally answered every wrong number call as if he were the doctor's office. If someone said they had the sniffles from working in the yard, he'd respond, "You'd better come right in." If someone mentioned a little cough when smoking, he'd tell them, "Come on in." Even something as simple as a temperature of 98.9, he'd treat like it needed immediate attention. Parents calling about physicals for their kids. He'd promised they could all be seen together that same day. He never turned anyone away and made plenty of appointments, including 6 different routine checkups all at the same time slot on one Friday afternoon. It didn't take long for the chaos to hit the doctor's office. By Monday morning, the doctor himself called Mark, practically begging him to stop. Mark told him calmly, "I will, if you will." By the end of the week, the doctor's practice had a brand new phone number. That's where the story ends. That was a perfect example of creative problem solving. What really stood out was how Mark didn't argue or fight. He just flipped the situation back on the doctor in such a calm, almost playful way. The image of patients showing up for 6 simultaneous checkups made me laugh. It's interesting how something as small as a single digit in a phone number created such chaos. And the fact that it only took a couple of days of appointments for the doctor to finally cave says a lot. Sometimes the smartest payback is the simplest. This next story is about a neighbor who tried to claim ownership of a property line, only to find out the truth left him with far less yard than he thought. This happened years ago, but I still remember it clearly. When we first moved into this neighborhood, the houses were pretty close together. The kitchen windows lined up in a way that made it feel like our neighbors could just look straight in. My parents wanted more privacy, so they invested in a row of plants that cost thousands of dollars. It wasn't cheap, but they thought it would be worth it for the peace of mind. Just a week later, my parents woke up to find every single plant cut down. My dad was furious. He marched straight over to the neighbor's house to confront him. The neighbor claimed the plants were on his property line, so he said he had every right to remove them. He even went so far as to threaten that if anything crossed onto his property again, he'd report us to the authorities. Later that day, my dad called the landscaping company. Luckily, the plants were under warranty, so they agreed to replant them the following week at no cost. This time, we were extra careful to make sure they were entirely on our side of the property. Everything should have been settled, but a few nights later, around 2 a.m, we caught the neighbor chopping them down again. That time, we called the police and reported it as destruction of property. The neighbor didn't take it well, but after that, he finally agreed to call in a professional to officially mark the property line. My dad agreed too, just to put the whole issue to rest. A few days later, I came home to find bright orange tape marking the boundaries, and that's when it all came crashing down on the neighbor. His fence wasn't even close to the property line. It was 11 feet over onto our land. We watched as he had to take the entire fence down, looking completely furious the whole time. Within a month, we had our plants back in place. Our backyard felt more private than ever, and we gained 11 extra feet of space that had technically been ours all along. As for the neighbor, he not only lost about a quarter of his backyard, but he was also hit with a bill of nearly $10,000 for the damage he caused to our property. Meanwhile, we ended up with exactly what we wanted: our plants, our privacy, and even more yard than before. That's where this story finishes. That was one of those situations where pushing too hard totally backfired. The fact that he went out at 2 a.m. to chop the plants down just makes it even pettier. What stood out to me most was how his win turned into losing a whole chunk of his yard and getting stuck with a massive bill. And honestly, I can imagine how satisfying it must have been to watch those orange boundary markers go up and see the truth come out. Sometimes karma doesn't take long at all. This next story is about an employee dealing with an overbearing supervisor who nitpicked everything until a simple act of pettiness completely flipped the office dynamic. When I started this job a few months back, I quickly realized my supervisor, let's call him Josh, was the type who couldn't help but micromanage. Every little thing I did seemed to invite criticism. I tried to handle it professionally, asking him directly what his expectations were and what exactly I should be doing differently. But his answers were always vague, usually something like, just do better. At one point, I even had to sit down with HR and Josh to try to address the issue. Nothing came of it. He kept nitpicking without offering anything constructive. Then yesterday, he took things a step further. He came to my desk and told me I needed to dress better. Now, here's the thing. Our office is extremely casual. People wear jeans, hoodies, t-shirts, even baseball caps. Meanwhile, I never wear hats, and I always make a point to wear collared button-up shirts with chinos or dress slacks. On the day in question, I had on a long-sleeve flannel, chinos, and Adidas sneakers. Not exactly sloppy. So I asked him for specifics. Should I be wearing dress shoes, A tucked-in shirt? What exactly did he want me to change? His answer, the same as always. Vague. Just dress better. And then he told me to talk to HR for clarification. So I did. HR gave me the basic rundown. Pants, closed-toe shoes, no sleeveless shirts. Nothing I'd ever worn had been a problem. They flat out told me I was fine. At that point, I was frustrated and ready to make a point. So this morning, I showed up in a full suit, tailored, sharp, the kind of thing I usually save for weddings. It was ridiculously overdressed compared to everyone else in the office. People immediately started asking what the occasion was. Whenever someone asked, I told them honestly, I'd been told to dress better. That was always met with disbelief. And a couple of people even said they liked the way I normally dressed. When folks asked who had made that call, I told them it was Josh. I figured I'd keep this going for a week, just to highlight how absurd it was. But by the afternoon, the whole office seemed to know. Word got around so fast that the CEO himself stopped by my desk. He told me that from now on, I'd be reporting directly to him, and that he'd be having a conversation with Josh about this and other issues. Since I was Josh's only direct report, that basically meant Josh was no longer a supervisor at all, just another employee. I walked out that day on a bit of a high, and honestly, tomorrow I think I'll just throw on one of my regular flannels again. That's the end of this story. That one was hilarious in the best way. The image of everyone showing up casual and then you rolling in with a wedding suit just to make a point is priceless. What surprised me most is how fast it escalated all the way to the CEO. Like, one little stunt and suddenly Josh lost his only bit of authority. It's funny how sometimes the smallest acts of pettiness end up being the most effective. And I have to say, the idea of going back to flannels right after is the perfect finishing touch. This next story is about an ex-husband who thought he could keep taking advantage of his ex-wife through her account, only to get blindsided when everything caught up to him. Back when I was working in the billing queue at a call center for one of the big 3 telecom companies, I got a call from a woman who was confused about her bill. She noticed a one-time charge of $49 for a wireless access point, the kind used for a set-top box with optic TV. The thing was, she didn't even have TV service with us. Naturally, she disputed the charge. But when I checked her account, it showed that optic TV had been added about a month earlier. She insisted it wasn't possible. Optic TV wasn't even available in her small town. That's when I did some digging. Sure enough, someone was still listed on her account, and that person had signed up for a 3-year contract. They'd done it to snag a free TV as part of a bundle with internet and TV service, and that someone was her ex-husband. At that point, the woman broke down in tears. She told me her ex had cheated on her with a younger woman, divorced her, and drained her financially in the process. He then disappeared, moved to Alberta, changed his number, switched emails, blocked her everywhere on social media, and cut off all contact. I felt awful for her, but I also had to explain that if she canceled the services outright, she'd be hit with hefty cancellation fees. What I could do, though, was remove his access from the account, add a password so only she could make changes, downgrade the internet and TV to the bare minimum, and even attempt to redirect the free TV to her address instead of his. I couldn't guarantee that last part since it had already been processed, but I figured it was worth trying. That's when something clicked for her. She got really quiet and asked, "Wait, you can see where he's living now?" I explained that yes, since he had services installed, there was a service address on file. And because this was her account, she had full access to the addresses, phone numbers, and emails tied to it. She was stunned. She told me that she and her lawyer had been trying to track him down for months, but his family and friends were covering for him. She asked if I could provide the details. I asked if she had a pen and paper ready. Then I read off the service address, his new cell number, and even the second number listed, likely his new partner's. She was ecstatic. After giving her all the information, I finished downgrading the services and secured the account with a new PIN. To top it off, I knew he was a hockey fan, and there was a game airing that night. I couldn't help but imagine him sitting down, ready to watch, only for the feed to suddenly cut out. Then he'd call in, confused and angry, only to find he was locked out of the account and discovered by the ex-wife and her lawyer. That story wraps up here. That's one of those rare moments where everything lined up almost too perfectly. What stuck with me most was how quickly the situation flipped. He thought he was still in control, but in one phone call, it all unraveled. The thought of him settling in to watch his team play and then losing access is just the cherry on top. It's also wild how the ex-wife went from devastated to ecstatic in a matter of minutes, all because the truth finally caught up with him. Honestly, that must have felt incredibly satisfying. This next story is about a tenant who got one of the most ridiculous final bills after moving out and decided to handle it in the pettiest way possible. Back in 2019, I moved out of an apartment complex in Celebration, Florida, into a condo. Like most apartment moves, I got a final bill that included the usual stuff: prorated rent, security deposit adjustments, and damage deductions. Everything was squared away and paid. Then the next month, my wife calls me and says another bill just showed up in the mail. This time, it was for 2 cents. 2 actual pennies. We both work in tech, so we laughed at the idea that their system actually spent 50 cents on postage just to chase us for 2 cents. It seemed like the kind of silly glitch you'd expect a computer to miss. Still, I figured I'd take care of it. My wife printed the bill, I grabbed 2 pennies from the change jar, and since the complex was on my daily drive, I stopped by the office. I walked in, handed the manager the paper, and said, "Hey, here's my final bill. It's for 2 cents, and I've got the coins if you want them." She just looked at me and said, "We don't take cash." That was it. Silence. I thought she was joking, so I laughed and said, "I don't actually expect you to take cash. I figured we'd both laugh about how silly this is, and you'd write it off since it costs way more to process than it's worth." She stared at me and said, "I'm not going to do that." Another pause, so I asked, "So you want me to write a check for 2 cents? And mail it? And then you're really going to process it?" She just said, "Yes, send us a check," and then walked straight back into her office. At that point, I decided to have some fun. I went home, set up an automatic monthly bank payment to the apartment complex for 3 cents. Every month, they get more than they asked for. And because I'm a programmer, I wrote a little script that automatically mailed them a letter each month saying, "I'm so sorry, I've overpaid my bill. Please send me a refund for the extra penny." To make things better, I used an online service that could send oversized postcards, up to 18 by 24 inches, just in case I needed to escalate my petty revenge. By the first of the very next month, I got a phone call from the regional manager. He introduced himself, and then spent the next 2 minutes giving me the most sincere apology I've ever heard. He practically begged me to stop, admitted they'd made a mistake, and promised I'd never hear from them again. I shut off the autopay and the mailers, and that was the end of it. Did I spend hours of my life over 2 cents? Yes. Was it worth it? Absolutely. That's where the story ends. That one made me laugh way too hard. The mental image of a corporate office getting giant postcards over a single penny is just priceless. What I loved most was how quickly they folded once it reached the regional manager. It went from stubborn silence to full-blown apology in no time. It's one of those stories where the pettiness is so over the top that you can't help but admire it. Honestly, 2 cents never had more power. This next story is about a brutal divorce battle, where one ex's lawyer pushed way too hard, only to have his own office completely overwhelmed by a perfectly legal wave of paperwork. Several years ago, I was in the middle of a messy divorce and custody fight. Things were already tense, but my ex made it worse by telling her lawyer that I was laundering money and hiding income. That wasn't true, of course. I didn't have the kind of assets that rich people hide, but she said it anyway, and her lawyer ran with it. I couldn't even afford my own attorney at the time, so I represented myself. Her lawyer wasn't the absolute worst, but he had that attitude, talking down to me like I didn't deserve to be in the same room. One day, I got a letter from him demanding 3 years' worth of financial records and updated income declarations. The list was ridiculously long, and for me, it wasn't just about the time. I was running a small communications tech startup, finishing my MBA on scholarships and loans, and money was tight. Printing and mailing all that meant I'd be eating peanut butter and crackers for a week. So I called him to explain my situation. He didn't buy a word of it. In fact, he basically mocked me and asked what I even did all day, since, according to him, I wasn't that busy. He threatened to accuse me of fraud and report me to the DA, the state tax agency, even the IRS, if I didn't send everything by the deadline. Probably an empty threat, but I wasn't about to risk it. That's when I remembered. My company provided electronic fax services, which most people didn't really understand back then. So I asked him if he had a fax machine. He scoffed and said, of course he did. What law office doesn't? And that gave me the perfect idea. I gathered every document I could get my hands on. Not just the required stuff, but absolutely everything. Bank statements, credit card bills, vendor invoices, client receipts. I even scanned in things like McDonald's receipts and those mile-long CVS receipts with coupons hanging off them. I pulled down 3 full years of accounting journals, balance sheets, profit and loss statements, cash flow reports, and every single piece of mail I'd ever gotten from the IRS. To make it neat and impossible to miss, I added bold separator pages in giant fonts that read things like 2017 taxes or 2018 receipts. When I was done, the file was over 150 pages long. I set it up on my eFax system and sent it through. At first, I kept getting failure notices. No problem, I just set it to unlimited retries. Every hour, their fax machine tried to spit out more and more of my endless file. It chewed through paper and toner, jammed constantly, and apparently wouldn't stop restarting. 2 days later, someone from his office finally called me, practically begging me to stop. I told her politely that her boss had demanded these financials and threatened me with the DA and the IRS, so I wasn't going to stop until I got a confirmation that they had every single page. She asked me to just email it, but I told her my email system couldn't handle a file that big. Unless they reimbursed me for printing and postage, faxing was the only way. Eventually, the lawyer himself got on the line. He tried to tell me to just stop, but I said I'd need it in writing. After a long pause, he hung up. Not 20 minutes later, I got an email from his assistant with a signed letter saying I no longer needed to provide the financials. They tried to tack on a threat about sanctions, but nothing ever came of it. From that day forward, he never mentioned fraud, sanctions, or financials again. That's where the story ends. That one was just beautiful. The thought of an entire law office trapped by their own fax machine, endlessly printing receipts for toothpaste and fast food, is hilarious. What really stood out to me was how quickly their tough talk disappeared once they realized you weren't bluffing. I can just imagine the frustration every time they had to reload paper or unjam the machine. It's one of those rare moments where the underdog flips the script completely, and it makes for such a satisfying ending. This next story is about a longtime employee at a big company who found himself targeted by HR as he neared retirement, only for them to discover he wasn't someone they could push around. My dad spent decades working for a Fortune 500 company, starting back in the 70s. He worked his way up as a software engineer, eventually stepping into management and even earned patents that saved the company millions of dollars. He was loyal, reliable, and almost at pension age when things suddenly turned sour. He noticed a pattern. Other employees who were getting close to 60 were being hassled too, almost like HR was trying to nudge them out early. Then, sure enough, HR called him in one day. They accused him of not clocking in and out properly. Now my dad is incredibly detail-oriented, an engineer to the core, so he told them to prove it. A week later, they couldn't. He reminded them he'd been driving the corporate carpool bus from a city 40 miles away for the last 15 years. He always had 16 witnesses to his arrival times, and in all that time, he hadn't been late once. But they didn't stop there. Another week later, HR tried again. This time they said he'd been letting people into the building without swiping his badge. They showed him footage where he held the door open for someone. The someone was his best friend of 35 years, a fellow employee who had lost his foot to diabetes and used a wheelchair. What HR didn't know was that my dad had already taken precautions. He'd gone out to lunch with the head of security and explained what was happening, and he had security footage of his own. So when they confronted him, he leaned in and said, "You're going to fire me for holding the door for my friend in a wheelchair? Then I hope you fire the CEO and yourself too." And with that, he showed them footage of the HR lady and even the CEO holding the same door for the same man. That pretty much ended their case against him. My dad kept working, made it to pension age, and left on his own terms. Later, in retirement, he even started his own company, working on clean water and renewable energy inventions. That's the end of this story. That one really stuck with me. HR trying to trip him up over something as basic as holding the door open for a friend in a wheelchair is just absurd. What stood out was how calmly he flipped the whole thing on them, with the exact evidence they thought they had against him. It's one of those moments where you can almost feel the room go silent as the tables turn. And honestly, it's inspiring to hear he didn't just retire quietly. He went on to build something meaningful after all that. This next story is about a construction boss who thought docking everyone's time for being a couple of minutes late would make him look tough, only to have his whole crew push back in a way he didn't expect. About 4 years ago, I was working construction. We started pretty early in the morning, officially at 6 o'clock sharp. Most of the crew was pretty good about showing up, but sometimes guys would roll in a minute or two late, like 6:02 or 6:03. Nothing major. The funny part was, our boss himself was late more often than any of us. But one day he decided he'd had enough. He called everyone together and announced, "If you're not standing in front of me at 6 o'clock on the dot, I'm docking 15 minutes from your pay that day." The very next morning, I accidentally left my tape measure in my car and had to walk across the site to grab it. I came back inside right at 6:01. That was it. 1 minute passed. The boss chewed me out and reminded me that he was serious about his rule. He docked me 15 minutes. So right then and there, I set my tools down, sat on a bucket, and waited. He looked confused and asked why I wasn't working. I told him, "I'm not getting paid until 6:15, so I'm not working until 6:15. I enjoy the job, but I don't do it for free." He tried to argue, but I pushed back. I told him if he was asking me to work after docking my time, that was basically asking me to work for free, and that's against the law. I even said, "Do you really want to open the company up to that risk? Maybe I'm the kind of guy who sues, maybe I'm not. But if you keep telling me to work for free, you'll find out." That shut him up fast. The rest of the crew saw me stand my ground, and after that, nobody played along with his rule. If someone was going to be 2 minutes late, they'd just text him and say, "Hey boss, I would have been there at 6:02 and docked anyway, so I'll see you at 6:15. Then they'd sit in their cars until their time started. Between me refusing to work off the clock and others sitting out until 6:15, productivity dropped hard. Morale tanked too, all because he wanted to act like a big shot over a couple of minutes. The thing is, we never actually got rolling right at 6 anyway. Usually, everyone spent the first 10 minutes standing around, talking, and gathering materials for the day. So his rule just made things worse. After a few weeks, his higher-ups noticed the deadline slipping and chewed him out for mismanaging the team. The bad timesheets made him look like a terrible leader. Not long after that, his little policy disappeared. Everyone went back to work like normal, and we caught up on deadlines pretty quick. Of course, after that, I was on his bad side. He made me a target and eventually stacked up enough bogus write-ups to fire me a couple of months later, right after I had to take some time off to look after my mom when she fell. But at least in that moment, the crew stood strong together, and he got put in his place. That's where this story ends. I actually really liked this one because it shows how fast things can flip when workers push back as a group. What stood out was how ridiculous the whole situation was. 15 minutes lost for being a single minute late. But in practice, it just cost him way more than that. It made me laugh, thinking about guys just sitting in their trucks until 6:15 instead of giving in. It's a good reminder that sometimes the simplest response, just refusing to play along, hits harder than any argument ever could. This next story is about someone who accidentally got access to a stranger's Netflix account and ended up riding that wave for nearly a decade. Somewhere between 8 and 10 years ago, I got an email welcoming me to Netflix. The thing was, I hadn't signed up for Netflix. At first I thought it was just a mistake, so I contacted the company. They told me that someone must have accidentally used my email when they created their account. Apparently, we had the same last name and the same first initial, so it made sense how the mix-up could have happened. I figured it would be simple to fix. I asked them to just remove my email from that account and let the other person know so they could update it with the right one. But that's where it got messy. Netflix said they couldn't remove the email because it was the only one on the account and they had no way of proving it was mine. I even suggested they dictate something to me over the phone, and I'd email it back word for word to show I owned the email. Still, not good enough. Their solution was to reset the account password, forcing the actual customer to call in and sort it out. Except it didn't work. I kept getting Netflix emails anyway. I called back, same problem. After a while, I realized I could just use the forgot password feature myself. Since the reset email came to me, I could change the password whenever I wanted. And yet somehow, the original user always managed to get back in without fixing the email. I never understood how, and honestly, I stopped caring. For almost 10 years, I had Netflix on everything. My phone, my Xbox, hotel TVs while traveling, you name it. I always logged in under the profile called Family and told my kid to do the same. That profile became ours, completely filled with our watch history. The other profiles, Fred, Softy, and Lila, had their own histories, but I never touched them except out of curiosity. Not once did I see something pop up in family that wasn't from us. And then, just this morning, I got an email from Netflix saying that my email was no longer tied to that account. After nearly a decade, it looks like Softy finally cleaned it up. Honestly, I just sat back and thought, well, thanks, Softy. That was one heck of a run. That's the end of this story. Man, 10 years of free Netflix is just wild. What made me laugh was how the whole thing started with a small mistake, and Netflix not being able to sort it out. And instead of turning into a hassle, it basically turned into a free subscription for almost a decade. The best part is the storyteller stuck to one profile the whole time, like a respectful ghost user. And honestly, the sign off to Softy at the end just made the whole thing feel weirdly wholesome. This next story is about a strict company policy that backfired when an employee decided to follow the rules a little too closely. At the office where I work, we have this annual 8-week busy season where everyone is expected to pull 12 to 14-hour days. During that stretch, the company tries to soften the blow a bit by covering dinner expenses. The deal is simple. You can get reimbursed for up to $13 per meal, as long as you save your receipts and submit them at the end of the season. Now, most of the food places near work aren't great, so to save money and avoid eating junk all the time, I usually pack dinner from home. But there were a handful of nights where I was just too wiped out to cook, so I bought something instead. Out of the entire busy season, I only purchased about 10 meals. 3 of those happened to be $13.50, just 50 cents over the company limit. That came out to a grand total of $1.50 over the policy. My manager, who knew how hard we were working, told me not to worry about it. He even signed off on my expense report, including the tiny overage. I figured that was the end of it. But a few days later, I got an email from head office. They rejected the entire claim. The email flat out said I'd have to remove the $1.50 before they consider reimbursing me for any of it. They reminded me rather smugly that overages are not allowed under any circumstances, and finished off with a little dig, saying I should actually read the company policy next time. So I did. I pulled up the policy and read it line by line. And yeah, they were right, the $13 max was clear. But then I noticed something else buried in the text. The policy also allowed a $10 per diem for meals you bring from home. That was my golden ticket. I took off the tiny $1.50 they complained about, and then I added in 30 meals I'd packed myself over those 8 weeks. That came out to an extra $300 in reimbursable expenses, all thanks to me actually reading the policy, just like they told me to. That's where the story ends. That one is such a classic case of management being overly strict and shooting themselves in the foot. They wanted to nitpick over $1 and some change, and it ended up costing them hundreds instead. What stood out to me was how calmly the person handled it. No fighting, no arguing, just quietly flipping the rules back on them. It's one of those moments where you can almost picture the look on the finance team's face when that revised claim came through. Honestly, that's just beautiful compliance in action. This next story is about a high school student who got held back over gym class, only to find a clever way around the system. Back in high school, I couldn't stand gym class, not because I was out of shape or anything. I actually played both hockey and football, so the physical part wasn't the issue. What really bothered me was that there wasn't enough time to shower before the next bell. That meant sitting through the rest of the day feeling sweaty and gross, and I just hated it. So instead of running laps like the coaches wanted, I'd walk the track with the girls. That choice really ticked off my coaches, and they decided to make an example out of me. They flunked me in gym my junior year. When senior year came around, I asked if I could double up to make up the credit, but they flat out refused. That meant I'd have to repeat the year, basically just to take gym class again. At first I thought I was completely screwed. I'd already been accepted into a tech school, and all I needed to do was finish my senior year. So I tried to work something out with my guidance counselor and the coach, but neither of them would budge. It felt like they had me cornered. But then I started thinking, maybe there was another way. I called the college I'd already been accepted into and explained the situation. To my surprise, they told me that since they were a non-traditional school, I didn't need a diploma to start classes. I just needed to eventually get a diploma or its equivalent, and in my state, there was no difference between the two. Armed with that info, I set up another meeting with the high school administration, hoping they'd finally come around. Nope, they still stuck to their guns. So I stood up and told them flat out, well, I'm just gonna have to drop out then. I can't see missing a year of college just to take gym class. The coach smirked and said, you can't go to college without a diploma. That's when I repeated exactly what the tech school told me about their policy. And that's when I saw their faces drop. The guidance counselor looked like she just realized how bad it would look if I dropped out, especially since we were such a small school and the state would definitely notice. She started backpedaling, but I wasn't having it. That night, the principal and vice principal actually called me, trying to talk it over. But by then, I was already too excited about starting college in the fall to care. That's the end of this story. It's wild how something as tiny as a gym credit could have thrown everything off track. The way the school went from doubling down to scrambling once there was another option really stands out. It kind of shows how rigid systems can fall apart the second someone finds a workaround. And honestly, it's just satisfying to see things flip like that instead of ending unfairly. This next story is about a messy breakup where an ex tried to dodge paying her share of the bills, only to end up with debt collectors on her back. Back when I was living with my girlfriend and a roommate, we had this system where all the bills were split evenly. At least that was the plan. The rent was in my name, the electricity was in hers, and other bills were spread around. But in reality, I was the one paying most of it, especially her share. Looking back, I was way too generous. Things between us went downhill fast. She had smelly pets, never pulled her weight with chores, and arguments became constant. Eventually, I broke it off. The breakup was messy, and she dragged her feet moving out, milking every last bit before she finally left. The moment she was gone, I set up a new electricity account under my own name. A week later, I got the confirmation letter in the mail, along with the old electricity bill from when she was still living there. It covered the last 3 months and totaled about $120. Out of habit, I opened it, then texted her, "Yo, you got the electricity bill in the mail. It's $120, so come pick up $40 from each of us." Her reply, "Where's the other $40? We agreed I wouldn't pay bills after I moved out." I pointed out that she had still been living there during that billing period, but she doubled down. "This is bullshit. I'm not paying a thing." Then she tried to play power games. The way I see it, you can either bring the $120 to my place or have fun in the dark, lol. That's when it hit me. She didn't know I'd already switched the account into my name. She thought she had the leverage, but in reality, she was just racking up debt. Over the next few weeks, more letters arrived in her name. First just bills, then what I assume were late payment notices. Eventually, I noticed the envelopes had a new return address. A quick search showed they were from a debt collection agency. At that point, I didn't even bother contacting her anymore. Then, out of the blue, I got a call from her, absolutely panicking. She was yelling about debt collectors calling her parents' house, screaming about late fees piling up. I kept calm and told her the same thing she told me. "If you want our part of the bill, you know what to do." She finally caved. She came by to collect, but she only got the original $40 from each of us, not a penny more. My roommate and I weren't about to cover her late fees. I probably looked way too smug handing her that money for the last time, but honestly, it felt like the perfect ending. That story wraps up here. The part that really jumps out here is how fast things flipped once those debt collectors got involved. It's almost like she was so confident in her little game that she didn't realize she was the only one who could lose. The irony of threatening someone with "have fun in the dark," only to end up in a mess of late fees is pretty hilarious. Honestly, that's the kind of ending that feels both chaotic and satisfying at the same time. This next story is about a company that tried to save pennies on critical equipment, only to waste tens of thousands before finally being called out by their own team. Back when dial-up internet was still a thing, I was working in the engineering department of a growing company. The business had started small, privately owned by a handful of VPs who each put in their own money to get it off the ground. By the time this story happened, the company was pulling in something like 30 to 40 million a year in profits. But the leadership still acted like it was a scrappy startup, cutting corners in all the wrong places. In engineering, we were designing circuit boards with embedded computer systems. To program them, instead of soldering the microcontroller directly, we'd use a socket and plug in an in-circuit emulator, or ICE. This thing basically pretended to be the microcontroller and let us program it. It was clunky, it gave our tiny IT department headaches, and it was insanely expensive. $15,000 for just one, and we were renting it. The rent alone was $4,000 a month. At first, everyone thought this was just temporary. The CTO and marketing VP built an entire product line around this specific family of microcontrollers, so we knew we'd need the ice for the long haul. After the first month, we asked management to just buy it outright. The engineering VP took one look at the price tag and told us no, just keep renting. We shrugged it off and got back to work. Months rolled by and the plans kept growing. Marketing pre-ordered millions of chips, and we were still stuck renting the same piece of hardware. After a full year of bleeding money on it, finance finally noticed the recurring cost. They dug into the contract and traced it back to the original approval from the engineering VP. The paper trail even showed where he turned down our request to buy it outright. By the end of that week, the company suddenly owned not one, but 2 ICE units. Hitachi stopped charging us rent and just let us keep the first one, and finance approved the purchase of a second one so projects wouldn't bottleneck. We had been paying for a year of rent, $40,000 wasted, just because one VP didn't want to commit. The best part? At the next department meeting, that same VP tried to tell us there wasn't enough money to upgrade our PCs. One of the engineers piped up with, "Would $40,000 cover it?" Let's just say the company magically found the budget after that. That's the end of this story. The funniest part here is how the waste was completely invisible until finance finally stepped in. $4,000 a month just slipping away while the VP was pinching pennies on computers is wild. The little jab about the $40,000 at the meeting really sealed it. Perfect timing. It's one of those moments where you can almost feel the whole room silently nodding like, yeah, we didn't forget. This next story is about a strict driving rule that backfired when a teenager used it against his parents and stepsister in the perfect bit of malicious compliance. When I was 16, I had just gotten my driver's license, and that first taste of freedom felt incredible. One day, my parents asked me to run to the store to pick up some groceries. On the way home, I swung by my friend's place for maybe 5 minutes, just to show off that I could finally drive alone. To me, it was a fun little milestone, but my stepmom, Marianne, absolutely flipped. She told me they had not given me permission to go to my friend's house, only to the store, and that was it. I reminded her that they let me drive to a different friend's house the day before, so I didn't think it was a big deal. That didn't matter. She and my dad laid down a new rule. I was not allowed to drive anywhere unless I had explicit permission. No exceptions, no repeats from yesterday, nothing. Fast forward a few days. My 13-year-old stepsister, Tina, had been giving me grief all day. Later that afternoon, she suddenly turned sweet and told me it was time to take her to ballet. Normally, I was the one who drove her 3 days a week, almost like a chore. But this time, I saw my chance. I told her, "Sorry, Tina, I can't. The parents didn't tell me to, and I don't want to get in trouble." She went ballistic, screaming, crying, begging, even threatening me. She called both my dad and her mom and left messages, but no one got back to her. The minutes ticked by, and I just sat there, nerves buzzing, waiting to see if I had the guts to actually follow through. Sure enough, ballet time came and went, and she was still home. When Marianne came back, she was furious. Tina ran to her crying, saying I refused to take her. They both stormed down the hall, and Marianne actually shouted, "You just wait till your father gets home." I almost laughed. People really say that? An hour later, Dad came home, and both of them rushed outside to tell him how horrible I had been. I stayed in my room, waiting for the hammer to drop. Finally, he called me out to talk. But instead of punishing me, he just shook his head and said, "Well, Brian, you got us. There's nothing we can do about it." Right there, they admitted they had gone overboard. They agreed the rules needed to be reasonable, and they even talked to Tina about how she treated me. From then on, I was trusted with more freedom, since I'd always had good grades and never caused trouble. I walked back to my room with the biggest grin on my face, knowing I had won that round completely. That's where the story ends. What stands out here is how this turned into a real turning point, not just a funny win. The parents actually listened, admitted they'd been too strict, and even gave more trust in the end. That doesn't always happen, so it's nice to see a story where things settled into a better balance for everyone. It almost feels like the family walked away stronger after it. This next story is about an employee who tried to save the company money with a practical approach, only to run into rigid accounting rules that completely backfired. Many years ago, I was assigned to a work project that had me traveling to New York City every week, staying from Monday through Friday. My hotel was right near my manager's office in the theater district. If you've ever been in that part of the city, you know it's built for tourists. Restaurants everywhere, but they're usually pricey, fancy, and not exactly convenient after a long day. The company's travel policy allowed up to $30 or $40 per meal, which sounds generous. At first, I used that allowance, eating out at the nearby restaurants. But after a few days, it started to feel overindulgent, especially knowing I'd be stuck there for weeks on end. On top of that, I was working long hours, and the last thing I wanted after 12 hours in the office was to sit through a formal dinner. I just wanted something simple, then some TV, and then bed. So I came up with a better plan. On Monday evenings, I'd head to a grocery store. I'd grab cereal, sandwich supplies, snacks, and a few frozen meals I could microwave at the office. The total cost was about $60, and that food lasted me the entire week. To make it work, I'd take a couple cans of soda out of the hotel fridge to clear space, then put them back before I checked out. I did this for weeks, felt better, and actually spent way less than the meal allowance would have covered if I ate out every day. At the end of the month, I submitted my expense report. That's when accounting stepped in. A lady called me and told me she couldn't reimburse the $60 because it was over the $40 per meal maximum. I explained that the $60 covered 5 days of meals, not just one. Didn't matter. The rule was the rule. So for the next month, I stopped bothering with groceries. I went out for breakfast here and there, lunches whenever I had time, and dinners every single night. Sometimes it felt ridiculous ordering expensive meals just to stay within their rules. But hey, they told me groceries weren't allowed. By the end of that month, my NYC manager reached out. He asked why my food costs were suddenly so high, way more than the previous month. I told him exactly what happened with the grocery bills. A little while later, I got another call from the same accounting lady. This time her tone was completely different. She said they'd be reimbursing my original grocery bill and that, moving forward, groceries would be fine as long as the total weekly average stayed under the daily meal allowance. After that, I went right back to my simple plan: groceries, microwave meals, and the occasional dinner out. It made the whole assignment way easier. That's the end of this story. I like how this one shows the difference between rules on paper and reality on the ground. Sometimes the logical, cost-saving choice isn't what the system is set up for, and it takes someone pointing out the obvious for things to change. The part that made me laugh was how the company basically preferred expensive daily meals over a single grocery trip, at least until they did the math. At least it all worked out in the end, and the more reasonable option finally won. This next story is about a car dealership that tried to brush off a customer's repair costs, only to have their own arrogance backfire in a big way. This all started last December when I bought a used Mazda 5 from one of those buy here, pay here dealerships. It's basically the smallest minivan I've ever seen, and I actually loved it. But on Christmas Day, after dinner with family, it just wouldn't start. We checked everything, and the problems piled up fast. The horn wasn't even connected, half the fuses were missing, and the tires looked like they hadn't been replaced since the car rolled out of the factory. Hooking it up to a computer showed all kinds of errors, but the one that actually stopped it from running was the immobilizer. I didn't even know it had one until that moment. Because we were stuck in the middle of nowhere, I had to pay out of pocket for a tow and later submit the bill to AAA. Family let us borrow their car and we sent the van to a shop. The mechanic said they couldn't touch the immobilizer without permission from the dealer, so I set up a three-way call. For 17 straight minutes, I had the dealership, the shop, and myself on the line, and the dealer admitted we weren't behind on payments. They even told the shop to go ahead and bypass the immobilizer and said they'd reimburse us for the repairs and towing. A few days later, the van was fixed. Between the tow and the shop, it came to just under $300. That's when the game started. I called the dealership over and over, getting transferred around, disconnected, and fed excuses. At first, the reps seemed sympathetic, but then I finally landed on a manager named John. He flat out told me they weren't responsible for mechanical issues. When I pushed back and explained I had all the proof and call recordings, he cut me off and said, "What, are you going to take us to court over $296? Go ahead and sue. You probably don't even have the resources to pull it off." That comment lit a fire under me. I went to the courthouse, got the small claims paperwork, and with the help of Reddit, figured out how to fill it out properly. Instead of filing right away, I printed everything: transcripts, bills, recordings, and walked into the dealership myself. And wouldn't you know it, the same John who dismissed me over the phone was the one who sat across from me. At first, he brushed me off again until I slid the paperwork across the table and reminded him of his own words. I gave him one last chance before I walked out and filed the suit. That's when a woman in a sharp power suit overheard. She stepped in, introduced herself as John's boss's boss, and she was not happy. She took everything, gave me her direct cell number, and promised to fix it. The following Monday, at exactly 8 a.m., I got a call. They applied a $500 credit to my account, more than covering the repairs. She even admitted certain people were no longer employed because of how badly it had been handled. By Wednesday, when I went to make my next payment, it was already covered, all thanks to Power Suit Lady stepping in. That's where this story ends. What I like about this one is how it shows the difference between people who just try to brush you off and someone higher up who actually cares about fixing the problem. The manager was so confident you wouldn't push back, and then it completely unraveled when you showed up prepared. The detail about the Power Suit Lady stepping in feels almost cinematic, like she swooped in to clean up the mess. It's a reminder that persistence really can pay off, especially when you've got the receipts, literally and figuratively. This next story is about a kid's bake sale that turned into a showdown between parents when one neighbor tried to argue about who deserved the profits. A couple of weeks ago, my kids and their neighbor decided to set up a bake sale. We live in a tourist-heavy area, so with all the foot traffic, it's a pretty great spot for something like that. They were making a killing. I had joked with my kids that I should charge them for the ingredients and my time in the kitchen, just to teach them about net profits, but in the end, I decided I'd donate everything and just asked them to pay me back the small change I'd lent them to get started. Honestly, I loved watching how excited they were to set it all up and how hard they worked to make it happen. After a couple of hours, the neighbor's son suddenly got bored and decided he wanted to go home. But before he left, he told my kid, "When you're done, bring half the money over to my house." My kid wasn't having it. They pushed back, saying, "That's not fair. If you're leaving now, then we split the money right here." They ended up dividing it on the spot, which annoyed the neighbor's kid, and he stormed off in a huff. My kid stayed behind, packed everything up, hauled the gear home, and cleaned everything up. Later that afternoon, I got a knock on the door. It was the neighbor mom, standing there with her sulking son and holding a receipt. She explained that she had spent a lot of money on supplies for the bake sale, and that it wasn't fair that my kid was making money off things her kid had paid for. I glanced at the receipt and immediately noticed items that weren't even used, like 2 boxes of cereal when only one was opened, and napkins that I had actually supplied myself. Not to mention, I had been the one baking batches of cookies all morning, while her son ditched halfway through. But I kept it polite. I told her, of course, and then I went to grab my own receipts. Right there in front of her, I carefully calculated the cost of everything we used: flour, sugar, butter, chocolate chips, vanilla, even down to the lemonade and the cups. I multiplied out what went into each batch of cookies and even subtracted the leftover ones we didn't sell. I made a point of saying I tossed in the baking soda for free, just to show how fair I was being. When it was all tallied up, it turned out the neighbor's kid actually owed us $23. The look on their faces was priceless. Things got quiet really fast. I thanked the mom for wanting to make sure things were fair, and even offered her a plate of cookies to take home. She declined, and that was the end of it. That's the end of this story. This one made me laugh because the neighbor mom clearly thought she was going to walk away proving her point, but the math flipped it completely around. It's funny how people can overlook the effort and labor that goes into things, like all the baking and cleaning up, and just focus on money. What stood out most is how calmly it was handled. Just receipts, numbers, and facts. And offering cookies at the end, that's such a perfectly polite mic drop moment. This next story is about a high school student who fought back when the school tried to punish him for wearing a political shirt, sparking a legal battle that went far beyond what the administration expected. Back in 2008, I was in high school out in rural Texas when I found myself at the center of a federal lawsuit, all because I wore a shirt supporting then Democratic hopeful John Edwards. The administration tried to suspend me, saying it broke the dress code. The thing was, that rule was always enforced selectively. My parents stood firmly by my side, and my dad summed it up in his own blunt way, calling it redneck nonsense. During one of the first meetings, my principal even dragged in a school board member. They tried to warn me that if I got suspended, I'd probably get kicked off the football team. Supposedly, that could hurt my college chances. What they didn't realize was that football wasn't my ticket to college. I was a mediocre player at best, but a solid student. The way they faked concern about my future while trying to use it against me stuck with me for years. As the case kept moving, the pressure ramped up. First, they had the football coaches lecture me, saying that because of my selfishness, no one could wear Fellowship of Christian Athletes shirts anymore. It was supposed to embarrass me in front of the team. But honestly, I was already the fat kid who played Magic the Gathering at lunch. Embarrassment wasn't really a weapon they could use against me. Next, the administration held a meeting with all the teachers, telling them I was a problem student and that they should watch me closely. I didn't even know about that until years later, when one of my old teachers told me at a wedding. Then they went further, pulling in kids from my classes to try and dig up dirt. Every bad joke, every loud comment, even fart jokes ended up being reported. The vice principal sat me and my parents down and read every one of them out loud in front of my mom. That part stung, but my parents still knew what was really going on. Eventually, they used all of that as an excuse to expel me for 6 weeks, citing inappropriate conduct. They sent me to the Disciplinary Alternative Education program, which was basically a holding pen for kids the school didn't know how to handle. It was in a refurbished asylum, and all you could do was read or sit at a computer for monitored schoolwork. Extracurriculars were off the table too. I knew they wanted me to blow up so they could punish me more, so I chose the opposite. I poured all my time and frustration into my schoolwork. Stuff I'd normally coast through, I started doing with focus. My grades shot up, I started researching scholarships, and I found plenty that looked for activism. I suddenly had firsthand experience with that. So I applied to everything I could and wrote my school into the ground in every essay. On top of that, my dad and I found an attorney who agreed to take our case pro bono. That meant the school had to bleed money on legal fees while it cost us nothing to keep going. When I finally came back, I rejoined my teams and started aiming higher than ever. I applied to a prestigious honors program at my dream college, got accepted, and even landed more financial support than I thought possible. In the end, we lost the case, but the school had to abolish the dress code anyway because they couldn't afford the risk of being sued again. Now, years later, I've graduated from law school. I'm taking the bar in 2 weeks and already have a job investigating government corruption. So yeah, turns out I turned spite into a career. That's the end of this story. It's wild how a fight that started over a t-shirt turned into the foundation for an entire career. What stands out is the way that stubbornness and spite got channeled into something productive, almost like fuel for the future. The school thought they could intimidate and break him down, but all they really did was sharpen his resolve. And now he's out there using that same energy to keep people in power accountable. That's about as full circle as it gets. This next story is about a car dealership where management tried to cap commissions on high-demand vehicles, only to have the sales team push back in a clever way. Back in 2014, I was selling cars at a Ford dealership. That year was wild because both the Mustang and the F-150 were getting full redesigns for 2015. Ford had also announced there wouldn't be any Shelby Mustangs or Raptor F-150s for that model year. Practically overnight, the demand for those cars skyrocketed. The phones started ringing non-stop. People were desperate to get their hands on those models. And the few we had left suddenly came with $10,000 to $20,000 added on as market adjustments. Our general manager loved both of those vehicles and kept trading to get more of them on the lot. By the time this all shook out, we had 21 Raptors and 6 Shelbys sitting ready to sell. That was insane inventory for a dealership that usually moved fewer than 200 new cars a month. One of my sales that month was a ruby red Raptor extended cab. I sold it for $10,000 over sticker, and with a trade-in, my commission should have been around $4,200. When my paycheck came in, though, I was short, about $1,700 light. At first, I thought there had been some mistake, but it didn't take long to find out why. The following Saturday, we had a meeting, and management told us that commissions on Raptors and Shelbys were being capped at $2,500. Not just moving forward either, retroactively applied to the deals we had already closed. Apparently, it was buried in the pay plan, but nobody had ever enforced it until now. There was plenty of grumbling. Management's justification was that these deals were too easy, and they weren't wrong. There were no test drives until the deal was signed, and buyers were usually in and out within half an hour. Still, it was frustrating to see the dealership pocket so much and cut us off. That's when I decided to stir the pot. I built a little Excel tool that would take the invoice price, add in holdback and pack, and spit out the perfect sales price that made the commission exactly $2,500. I shared it with every salesperson in the building. Soon enough, every single buyer's order came across the desk with strangely specific numbers that capped commissions. It only took 3 of those deals before management caught on. They called another meeting, and this time they were furious. Lots of yelling. But the entire sales team stayed calm and gave them an ultimatum. Either remove the cap or they'd never see another deal go above it. 3 days later, the cap was gone. That's where this story ends. What really stands out here is how unified the sales team was. Usually in places like that, management relies on people being divided and looking out for themselves. But once everyone got on the same page, the dealership didn't have much choice. It's kind of satisfying how something as simple as a shared spreadsheet flipped the power dynamic. That's the kind of quiet teamwork that really makes an impact. This next story is about a job interview that took a strange turn when the manager accused the candidate of something they hadn't even done. A few years back, I was in school and looking for work when I landed an interview at an office job. The position was pretty straightforward: filing, answering phones, setting appointments, but I was honestly excited for it. After working retail and fast food, the idea of sitting in an office felt like a big step up. The building itself had these huge windows that overlooked the parking lot, so you could see every car pulling in. I parked in a normal spot, got out, and walked inside. On my way in, I noticed there was a car parked in the handicap space right up front. It looked a lot like mine, but I didn't think much of it and went inside. The manager greeted me, but right away, his whole demeanor felt off. Instead of being polite or welcoming, he gave me this scowl. He led me back to his office, and during the interview, he seemed short with me, almost annoyed. I couldn't figure out what I had done wrong. Then, out of nowhere, he asked me, "Do you always park in handicap spaces?" At first I thought he was joking, but he was dead serious. He started going on about how entitled I must be for parking there, and I was completely thrown off. I told him that I hadn't parked in the handicap spot, but he insisted that he saw me drive in, park there, and walk into the building. I tried to explain that he must have confused me with the other car outside that just looked like mine, but he doubled down and basically accused me of lying. At that point, I was over the whole thing. If this was how the manager handled things, I didn't want to work there anyway. When he told me to prove it, I pulled out my keys and walked out. He followed me outside, clearly expecting to catch me in a lie. His face dropped when I walked right past the car in the handicap spot and hit the button on my fob to unlock my actual car a few spaces away. I got in, started it up, and drove off without even giving him another glance. That's where this story ends. Imagine actually having to work for a guy like that, always ready to assume the worst without even listening. That interview probably saved a lot of future headaches. It's wild how some people in management get so wrapped up in their own authority that they can't even stop to think logically. The moment the car unlocked must have been priceless though, just pure silence and backpedaling. Sometimes dodging a job is the best outcome. This next story is about a tenant whose greedy new landlord tried to push them out with unfair rent hikes and shady tactics, only for things to backfire in a pretty spectacular way. Back in 2008, my family and I moved into a 5-bedroom house, about 3,200 square feet, for $1,600 a month. At the time, it was a decent deal, and over the years, the rent stayed the same. Since I'm pretty handy, I didn't bother the landlord for small fixes. I just handled things myself. In fact, I lived there so long that I started upgrading the place, installing organizers, adding a pond, improving the appliances, even putting in smart home features. Fast forward to 2024, the original owner passed away, and his son inherited the house. A week later, he showed up with a notice to inspect. He didn't just walk through though. He started trying to open drawers and go through my personal stuff. When I stopped him, he got rude. As he left, he handed me a notice saying my rent was going up to $4,000 a month, way above market value. I would have paid a fair increase, but not that. My lease was month to month, but it specifically required 3 months' notice for any rent increase. So I pointed that out, then gave notice myself that I'd be moving out at the end of that 3 months. A few days later, I was served with an eviction notice. Since he couldn't evict me without 3 months' notice either, he tried to say I had made unauthorized modifications, citing the back door with a dog door in it. Thing is, I still had the original door sitting in the garage, and the old owner had given me permission. Still, the judge told me I had to move out within 30 days, unless I wanted the eviction to go through. On top of that, the judge ordered that every modification be restored to the original condition. So that's exactly what I did. Every smart home device came out. The pond was filled back in. Closet organizers, gone. Garage storage, removed. The updated appliances got swapped for the cheapest models I could find. Even the tool shed I built was hauled away. I returned the house to bare bones condition and then moved out. The new landlord sued me for taking everything, claiming that improvements legally become part of the property. But my lawyer showed the judge the previous order. Everything had to be restored. On top of that, I had receipts proving I bought it all. The case was dismissed, and he had to cover my legal fees. A few months later, I got a call from his sister. She had some of my old mail and wanted to get it to me. In that conversation, she told me that the house wasn't his alone. It had actually been inherited by 4 siblings. He'd lied, telling them the house had negative equity and was worthless, while secretly planning to sell it to a rental company for profit. When the sale went through, his siblings learned the truth. The place sold for $550,000, but because of how badly he handled everything, they cut him out completely. The 3 of them split the money, and he walked away with nothing. That's the end of the story. That whole chain of events is wild. Imagine trying to squeeze someone out for money and ending up with nothing yourself. What gets me is how much patience it must have taken to carefully undo every improvement, down to the last detail. Honestly, the guy practically set his own trap and then fell right into it. And thinking about it, living under someone like that would have been miserable anyway, so walking away with a win like this probably felt even better. This next story is about a shady boss who lied about an employee's position to block them from a benefit the policy actually allowed, and when the truth came out, it changed everything. A few years back, I was working for a big retail company. I had been there for years, and eventually, with enough grad school under my belt, I earned my license for a higher level position. It came with more responsibilities, more job satisfaction, and better pay. But the job market was tough. Instead of landing a staff position at one store, I was put into a floater role, which meant covering a huge area and rotating between different stores. The farthest one was over 100 miles from home, and that's exactly where I got assigned to train. This store was rough. People in my role had been robbed and assaulted at gunpoint. The neighborhood was hostile, turnover was sky high, and the workload was crushing. Once my training was done, I expected to float around to different stores like the role was designed for. Instead, I was basically chained to that one location. Maybe once a month, I'd get assigned elsewhere. But otherwise, I was stuck. When I asked why, my boss claimed I was the only floater experienced enough to handle it. I didn't buy it, but I didn't have much leverage. A colleague tipped me off to the mileage reimbursement policy. If a floater traveled more than 50 miles from home, they could get reimbursed for the extra miles both ways. Meals were even covered. So I filled out a few forms and sent them to my boss to sign. He never signed them. Later, he claimed they must have gotten lost in the system. That same colleague eventually showed me how to bypass him completely by faxing the forms directly to accounts payable. So that's what I did. Not long after, my boss called me in a panic. He wanted me to stop submitting forms. I asked again to float closer to home, but he wouldn't budge. Instead, he promised me a staff position at that miserable store. No pay bump right away, but supposedly more stability down the road, if I stopped filing claims. I agreed, but the bump never came. 2 years later, the place had worn me down. I asked to step back into a regular floater role and rotate like I was supposed to. That's when my boss told me I had never been a staff member in the first place. According to him, I was always a floater, but he still wouldn't let me leave that store. I was furious. So I started looking elsewhere and eventually landed a chance to transition into my dream career. When I gave my notice, that's when the fun began. I had kept meticulous records of every shift, and the mileage policy didn't have a statute of limitations. So I started filling out reimbursement forms for every shift from the past 2 years. I didn't even bother with the meal reimbursements, just the mileage. A friendly manager signed off, and I faxed them directly to accounts payable. I didn't send them all at once. I spaced them out a few dozen at a time during my final 2 weeks. Then the checks started coming in, not added to my paycheck, but mailed directly to me as tax-free reimbursement. By the time my last paycheck hit, I had already collected thousands. A few weeks later, the charges must have shown up on some balance sheet because I got a call from my old boss. He wasn't happy. He pulled in a loss prevention manager and accused me of gaming the system. They threatened legal action if I didn't return all the money immediately, claiming I wasn't eligible as a staff member. But I had the email chain where my boss said I was never staff, always a floater. I politely reminded them of that, then pointed out HR had confirmed I was within policy the whole time. In the end, I got over $21,000 in reimbursements. I moved into my dream career, left that nightmare store behind, and had the satisfaction of knowing my boss's lies had cost him way more than he ever thought he could save by keeping me trapped. That's the end of this story. What really stands out here is how neatly the whole situation flipped. The boss tried to block reimbursements, tried to trap someone in the worst assignment, and in the end, that decision cost him tens of thousands. It's almost poetic. And honestly, the patience it must have taken to keep those records and wait until the very end, that's impressive. Imagine how awkward those phone calls must have been once the checks started landing. Sometimes all it takes is knowing the rules better than the person trying to bend them against you. This next story is about a student who found a clever way to get back at a classmate after she tried to exclude him from a weekly snack tradition. Back in high school, around 2010, I worked the closing shift at Dunkin' Donuts on Sunday nights. One of the perks of the job was that, per company policy, I could take home 24 donuts before tossing out the rest. My routine was simple. 1 dozen went with my dad to his work on Monday mornings, and the other dozen I'd bring to school, specifically to my Spanish class. It was a small class, and since most of the work involved practicing conversations with each other, we had a tight-knit group. The donuts quickly became a Monday tradition that everyone looked forward to. After a few weeks of this, one of my classmates, let's call her Anne, had an idea. She suggested we make a weekly snack day where everyone would bring in something to share. The class agreed on Thursdays. I figured since I was already bringing donuts on Mondays, I'd just keep doing that as my contribution. Everyone seemed fine with that, except Anne. She immediately shut that down. According to her, if I didn't bring something on Thursday, then I wasn't welcome to participate at all. That ticked me off, but I let it go for the moment. 1 snack, 1 time, no big deal. Still, it ate at me a little. If the rule was just to bring a snack, then it didn't have to be something sweet or even enjoyable. It only had to be edible. So the following Wednesday night, I stopped at the grocery store and bought a 5-pound bag of plain potatoes. I washed them, packed them into an empty Dunkin' Donuts box I had saved from work, and brought it into school early the next morning. I made sure to leave it in the Spanish classroom before anyone else arrived. By the time our class rolled around, other students had already seen the box and were buzzing about how we had donuts waiting for us. Everyone was hyped. When the moment came, I carried the box up front and set it on the Elmo projector, trying not to laugh at how heavy it was. Anne rushed up, opened the lid, and went from excitement to total frustration in seconds. Inside was nothing but potatoes. She spun around and accused me, saying, "You were supposed to bring a snack today." "I did," I said calmly, walking up to the box. I picked up a potato, took a big bite, and locked eyes with her while chewing. "You don't have to have any if you don't want." The whole class went dead quiet for a second before everyone slowly shuffled back to their desks. Anne floundered, trying to come up with a new argument, but nothing came out. I sat back down, eating my potato with as much triumph as I could muster. After class, I brought the rest of them home for my mom to use in cooking. From that day on, Anne couldn't try to exclude me anymore. And while my classmates were a little disappointed at first, once the initial shock wore off, most of them thought it was hilarious and completely fitting. That's the end of this story. The image of a Dunkin' Donuts box full of potatoes is just so funny to picture. The fact that Anne opened it expecting something sweet and got hit with plain potatoes instead makes it even better. Honestly, I think the bold move of taking a bite right in front of her sealed the whole moment. And really, if she was that controlling about a simple class snack day, imagine how exhausting it would be to deal with her in any bigger group project. Sometimes pettiness done right is just entertaining to watch. This next story is about a petty coworker who pushed too hard over someone being late. only to end up paying the price in a way they definitely didn't expect. Over the past year, my commute got longer and more unpredictable thanks to 4 different bridge closures that all happened within months of each other. Nobody had given any reopening dates, so unless I wanted to leave home absurdly early, there was always the risk I might show up a couple minutes late once or twice a week. Everyone at work knew how bad traffic had gotten. There was no pretending otherwise. But one coworker just couldn't let it go. Anytime I was a few minutes late, they'd get irritated, and eventually they complained about me so much behind my back that my supervisor reluctantly wrote me up. I knew exactly who it was, because whenever traffic came up in conversation, they'd roll their eyes, leave the room, or interrupt with nonsense just to shut it down. They had a reputation for being difficult. This was the same person who once managed to block a seasonal employee from getting rehired just by complaining enough. I really do love my job though, so I decided to shut down any excuse they might have. I started leaving home an hour and a half earlier every morning. That meant I was pulling into work anywhere from 15 to 45 minutes before my shift even started. And that's when I noticed something funny. This coworker had a little routine. Every day they'd show up about 10 minutes early and snag the same convenient parking spot right outside our building. It wasn't assigned, but they acted like it belonged to them. Well, now that I was arriving earlier than almost anyone, that spot was mine for the taking, and I took it. Every single day. Most of the time, I could park anywhere in the employee lot, but nothing made up for waking up at 5:30 in the morning, like watching them pull in and realize their personal spot was gone. To really drive it home, I've even parked dead center in a space wide enough to fit both cars, just to make sure they knew it wasn't theirs anymore. At this point, they can't complain about me being late because I'm always there long before I have to be. And since I've casually mentioned my new arrival time in front of other coworkers while they were within earshot, they know exactly why I'm parking there. Out of spite. I don't know if they've tried to complain to the supervisor about it or not, but honestly, I kind of hope they have. It would be hilarious if they actually had the nerve to complain about me taking a public parking space when they're the reason I'm at work so early in the first place. That story wraps up here. This is one of those cases where the revenge is so simple, but so perfect. Just the thought of that coworker pulling up every day and finding their spot taken must sting way more than they'd ever admit. And the fact that it all started because they pushed so hard over a few minutes of lateness makes it even sweeter. Honestly, if they ever did try to complain about a public parking spot, I'd love to be in the room just to hear how ridiculous they'd sound. It's the kind of thing that makes you laugh every time you picture it. This next story is about a high school teacher who clashed with a student's powerful parents after refusing to hand out unearned grades, and the creative way they turned the situation around. I had just moved to a new state to take a teaching job at a rural high school. For the most part, I liked the other teachers, and I enjoyed teaching the students. But as you'd expect in a small town, there were a few personalities that came with outsized influence. One student in particular stood out, not because of talent, but because she was unusually lazy. She rarely turned anything in on time, and when she did, the work was clearly rushed, incomplete, or just careless. To make it even stranger, she somehow had straight A's across the board in all her classes. It didn't take me long to figure out why. One day, she turned in yet another late, incomplete assignment, and I graded it generously with a D. That brought her overall grade in my class down to a B. The very next day, I was called into a meeting with the principal and both of her parents. And here's the kicker. Both parents worked in the school district. Her mom was a teacher at the middle school, and her dad was an administrator right there at the high school. They immediately came after me, saying I was being unfair and inconsistent with grading. They accused me of never handing out instructions. I calmly showed them the printed instruction sheet I'd passed out to everyone. Then they tried to say I didn't give her a copy. I pointed out that I remembered handing it directly to her while she was too busy making out with her boyfriend in class to notice. They didn't like that answer. Next, they claimed I hadn't been clear with the deadline. I pointed to the second line of the instructions where the due date was written, plain as day. Then they went after my grading. I pulled out her assignment and showed them exactly why it earned the grade it did. From their expressions, it was clear they'd never even seen her work before. At first, they tried to claim I must have mixed it up with another student's paper, until I flipped it over and showed her name on the top. Despite all of that, the principal asked me to just change the grade in the gradebook. I suggested maybe she could redo the assignment first, but her parents immediately shut that down. I could see why the principal gave in. In a small district that already struggled to keep staff, it wasn't worth fighting with two employees over their daughter's grade. So I went back to my classroom, opened up the gradebook, and changed her grade. But not just hers. I changed every single student's grade to 100. Suddenly, even the students who hadn't turned in a single assignment were showing perfect scores across the board. Pretty quickly, kids started asking me what was going on. I'd just smile and tell them not to worry about it. The rumors spread fast. Secretaries were whispering, other teachers were asking questions, even the principal came by later and asked me directly if I'd changed the grades. I told him yes. I changed her grade. He looked like he wanted to dig further, but in the end, he just shrugged and walked away. From then on, he never interfered with my gradebook again. The student herself got pulled from my class entirely, and not long after, her boyfriend transferred out too. That meant no more public makeout sessions in my classroom. Honestly, I counted that as a win. That's the end of this story. What I like here is how subtle but effective that move was. The teacher didn't argue, didn't make a big scene, just quietly proved a point that everyone in the school would notice. And honestly, it's telling that the principal backed off completely after that. Sometimes a creative response is harder to argue with than any fight. I can't help but imagine how awkward it must have been for those parents once the whole thing blew back on them. And as a bonus, the classroom itself got a lot calmer after those two left. This next story is about an ex who couldn't handle being outshined, and how a simple game of Sudoku turned into the perfect petty comeback. Back when I was in grad school, I dated a man who had just finished his master's degree in another STEM field and had gone on to start a company from his research. He was older than me by a few years, and for some reason, he carried around this big chip on his shoulder about going back to school in his late 20s. Even though I never thought of myself as smarter or better than him, he constantly projected this weird inferiority complex onto me. It was like he needed to remind himself that he was more clever, and over time, that dynamic really wore me down. Our relationship ended after about a year, and the breakup was messy. But despite all the tension, he insisted that we stay friends. One day, he asked me for a favor. He needed help picking up a moving truck for work. I agreed, and when we got in the car, we sat in silence for a few minutes. To pass the time, I pulled out my phone and opened a Sudoku puzzle I had been working on. Now, Sudoku is something I've been obsessed with since I was a kid. I used to carry books of puzzles on long bus rides and solve them over and over. By now, my brain is wired to spot the patterns almost instantly, and it's just something I do to relax. He noticed me playing and asked what app I used. I told him I preferred a certain website because most apps either made the puzzles ridiculously easy or frustratingly difficult, and the site I used had a good balance. I tried to keep my tone neutral, but he immediately jumped on it with this smug kind of, "Oh, really?" He pulled out his phone and told me to try the Sudoku app he used, swearing that I'd find it much harder than what I was used to. So I went along with it. I opened the app, selected the hardest puzzle, and started solving. In about a minute, I had it completely done. When I showed him the screen, I had beaten his best record by at least a minute and a half. His reaction was priceless. He looked stunned and muttered something about me just getting lucky. But instead of stopping there, I decided to make a point. I played a few more puzzles on his app, all on the hardest setting, until every single one of his top times was gone, replaced by mine. He didn't have a single record left. The best part came months later, long after I'd forgotten about it. Out of nowhere, he sent me a screenshot of his app showing a new record time. Except this time, it wasn't on the hardest setting. It was on the easiest one. That was too perfect to ignore. I downloaded the app myself, switched to the easiest puzzles, and blew past his time again without even trying. Then I sent him my own screenshot as a reply. Maybe it was a little mean, but I can't lie. It was incredibly satisfying. That's where the story ends. What cracks me up is how something as simple as Sudoku became this whole power struggle. The fact that he circled back months later just to prove himself on the easy setting says a lot. Honestly, it makes you wonder what it would have been like working with someone who always had to turn everything into a competition, and the petty comeback of beating him again on the easiest level. That's the kind of ending that just makes the whole story land perfectly. This next story is about a workplace showdown where an analyst kept getting stonewalled by IT, so they found a clever way to force a change. Back in 2018, I was working as a data analyst for an education technology company. One of my projects was to create a report for our sales team to use when negotiating contract renewals with clients, which were usually schools or whole school districts. The report was designed to be visual and easy to understand, full of graphs showing how teachers and students were using the product. It worked perfectly. Our biggest client loved it and signed on again. In fact, they loved it so much they asked for the same kind of report for every single renewal moving forward. That meant I had to automate the process so it could work for more than 5,000 clients. Here's where things started breaking down. The data for these reports lived in our company's database, and the only people with direct access were on the IT team. My department didn't have permission to query it ourselves. Instead, I had to put in a ticket, list the data I needed, and I could only request one client per ticket. On top of that, IT worked in 2-week sprints. Tickets I submitted would be placed into the next sprint, so I was waiting 2 to 4 weeks to get results. That was fine when it was just for one major client, but once I had to do this for all renewals, it was impossible. Sales didn't plan that far ahead, and I needed data quickly. I tried asking IT directly for database access, but they immediately shot me down. Their stance was that all data requests would be filled only by IT, and that I needed to stay in my lane. Sales wasn't happy with the delay, I wasn't happy either, but officially nothing could be done. That's when I got an idea. I reached out to one of the sales managers and asked for a list of every client with renewals coming up in the next few weeks. He understood exactly what I was planning, and he happily handed over a list of more than 400 clients. I knew IT planned their next sprint every other Friday afternoon, when tickets were usually light, so I cleared my calendar for that Friday and got to work. At a rate of about 1 ticket per minute, it took me over 6.5 hours to submit every single one of those requests. Because I submitted them before the cutoff, IT was required to finish all of them during the next sprint. And here's the kicker. They used Jira at the time, and most of the team had push notifications set up. That means their laptops were pinging with a new ticket every minute while they were trying to plan their sprint. I would have paid money to see their faces during that meeting. The following Monday, tickets started getting filled. Because I had automated my side of things, I was able to run reports as fast as they sent me data, and sales was thrilled. But I could tell IT was drowning. By the second week of that sprint, tickets were coming in late at night, which meant they were working long hours just to keep up. To their credit, they actually fulfilled every single one, but it clearly took a toll. Before the next sprint, I met with the sales manager again and got another list of clients. This time I only had about 200, but IT didn't know that. By 10 a.m. on Friday, after I'd started submitting tickets again, the head of IT stormed over to my desk. He asked with wide eyes how many tickets I was planning to submit. I told him the same amount as last time. You could see the life drain out of him. Then I added, casually, or you could just give me direct access to the database, and I can pull the data myself. By noon, my access was granted. That's the end of this story. What makes this so funny is how easily it could have been avoided. Instead of just giving access in the first place, they chose to dig their heels in until it backfired. Imagine sitting in that meeting with your laptop dinging every single minute for hours straight. That must have been absolute chaos. Honestly, it's one of those rare times where malicious compliance worked out perfectly and solved the problem once and for all. This next story is about a clueless boss who ignored clear instructions and ended up causing a massive disaster for the company. Back in the 1980s, I worked for a small, privately owned sporting goods company as the entire advertising department. It was just me. My main job was to design and produce 4 catalogs a year, and those catalogs were everything for the business. Pre-internet, they were our main sales driver, pulling in around $700,000 annually. The process back then was nothing like today. Everything was done by hand. I typed out the copy, reduced it on a photocopier to fit, developed photofilm myself, and printed the images. Once the layouts were ready, the printer had to add halftone screens, burn plates, and prepare everything for the press. It was time-consuming and expensive. Missing a deadline simply wasn't an option, which meant a lot of 16-hour days during crunch time. We mailed out about 50,000 catalogs per run, using a bulk mail service. That saved a lot of money, but it required a bulk mail permit. To qualify, the permit number, called a fiche, had to be printed directly on the catalog. It was a standard step, one I had done dozens of times. Then came Ron. He was hired as a favor to a friend of the owner, despite the fact that I was already handling everything myself. From day one, he micromanaged everything, slowed down the workflow, and constantly threatened me with, "My way or you're fired." When I finished the mock-up for our big summer catalog, I handed it over for his new approval step. He returned it covered with pointless revisions and, most importantly, a demand to remove the ugly permit box. He didn't understand that his last company had used envelopes, so the permit was on the envelope instead of the mailer. I pushed back and asked him to initial the changes, since this was the final version heading to the printer. He signed off. I knew what was coming, but my hands were tied. 50,000 catalogs rolled off the press and went straight to the mailer. The next day, the phone rang. The sales rep called saying, "We can't mail your catalogs." A few minutes later, Ron and the owner stormed into my office, veins bulging, screaming in my face. They demanded to know how this mistake happened. I calmly explained that Ron had insisted on removing the permit box and showed them the proof. The final copy, signed and initialed by him. At first, the owner was ready to give Ron another chance, but then the invoice came in. The printer had to stamp 50,000 catalogs by hand, renting out their own permit, and the total came to nearly $8,000, about 20 grand in today's money. On top of that, our summer sales took a massive hit, dropping about 50,000 compared to previous years, closer to 200 grand if you adjust for inflation. Ron didn't last after that. He was fired, and from that point on, I was left alone to run the department the way I always had. That's where the story ends. What gets me is how preventable that whole mess was. One stubborn decision ended up costing the company thousands and delaying their most important season. I can't imagine the panic in that mailroom when they realized 50,000 catalogs couldn't go out. At least the proof was right there in Ron's own initials, which is probably the most satisfying part of this whole thing. And honestly, the fact that the narrator was left alone afterward feels like the best possible outcome. This final story is about a cashier dealing with a rude customer who thought she was too important to wait her turn in line. I was working a closing shift at a gas station in Miami Gardens, Florida. It was one of those nights where the line had stacked up with about 7 people, and I was behind the counter stocking vaporizers and accessories. My register was closed, sign and all, while my coworker handled the line. Then the door opened, and in walked a woman without a mask. At that time, masks were still required, so I politely asked, "Excuse me, miss, do you have a mask you could put on?" She gave me this exaggerated eye roll, dug around in her purse for what felt like forever, and eventually pulled out this beat-up mask with only one working strap. She half-heartedly held it against her face while waiting. That lasted all of 2 minutes. When she finally reached the front of the line, she started ranting about how the line was too long and how a regular customer like her shouldn't have to wait. I'd never seen her before, and I knew all the regulars by face. I told her I had other things to get done per my manager's instructions, and that my coworker had the line covered, but she didn't want to hear it. She snapped, "I demand you open your register right now." Fine. I slid the closed sign away, looked right at her and said, "Do me a favor and stand a little to your right." She crossed her arms and shifted over, glaring at me. That's when I called out, "Next customer." The person behind her wasted no time stepping up before she even realized what was happening. She lost it, screaming at me, the mask completely forgotten, while I calmly finished the transaction with the other customer. When it was finally her turn, she tried yelling over me again, so I raised my voice and cut her off. I told her, "Just because my register is open doesn't mean you get to skip everyone else. These people also have jobs and lives, and they've been waiting patiently. If you can't respect that, I'll have you removed from the store." We didn't technically have security, but being 2 blocks away from the police station meant backup was always close by. She huffed, puffed, and finally slumped back into line. Except now it was longer. I pointed at the back and said, "I said the back of the line." Shoulders dropped like a sulking toddler. She shuffled off and took her spot at the very end. That's the end of this story. It's wild how some people think yelling will magically bend the world around them. Imagine being that worked up just because you didn't want to wait like everyone else. What I love most is that she ended up worse off than before. Her tantrum cost her even more time. Honestly, the mental image of her sulking to the back of the line makes this whole thing pretty hilarious. Sometimes patience really is the quiet winner. Anyways, that's all the stories I've got for today. I hope you enjoyed listening, or even just having this on in the background. If you have any subreddit suggestions, drop them in the comments and I'll check them out. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe with notifications to never miss an upload. But thanks for hanging out, and I'll see you in the next one.